Hello and welcome to another video review. This is John Woo Presents Stranglehold for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a third-person shooter developed by Midway Chicago and Tiger Hill Entertainment and published by Midway in fall of 2007, and it's interesting primarily for the fact that this is actually the sequel to the classic Hong Kong action movie Hard Boiled, which if you haven't seen is absolutely fantastic. And the game actually does have Chow Yun-fat reprising his role from Hard Boiled in this, so that is actually pretty cool. But oddly enough, this game just kind of slipped under the radar. You would think a John Woo video game would be kind of a big deal, but it just kind of passed without most people really knowing too much about it. And even though it did receive pretty favorable reviews when it came out, and most people I've seen who actually have played it seem to enjoy it, it didn't really get a whole lot of success. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly how it is, and whether or not it should be something that passes under your radar as well. Well, as far as the presentation goes, obviously it does look rather dated considering this was made almost a decade ago at this point. But even back in 2007, it wasn't exactly the best looking game around. I mean, you think about other games that came out in 2007, especially something like Crysis, for example, and it just doesn't hold a candle to stuff like that, although the game certainly doesn't look bad by any means, and in particular, the physics objects they've got in this thing really do a lot to help things out, and there are a lot of really nice stylistic choices that really do help the game not only achieve its John Woo feel, but also elevate it beyond simply looking kind of like a higher tier budget title of the time more than anything else. The amount of things you can smash up or blow chunks off of in the environment is downright glorious, and on top of that they have things like the bullet trails going through the air with a really cool effect. They've got sepia hue when you go into bullet time, or tequila time as it's known in this, and it's effects like that that really do help to give this game a lot of charm where it otherwise would just look fairly at best, and so they definitely deserve a lot of praise for that. That said, I did run into some weird issues here and there, like the resolution not wanting to go in 1080p for some reason, even though the game outright supports it just fine. In fact, all I had to do was go into the actual shortcut and give it a couple of parameters for Res X and Res Y to be the appropriate for 1920 by 1080, and every time I tried to alt-tab it, it actually crashed the game, so it is a bit rough around the edges, but even then, it still works just fine for the most part. It runs really well, and there's not really all that many glaring technical problems to worry about, except for the fact that the physics engine can kind of go crazy at times. I mean, you'll see bodies just flopping around like crazy, and that tends to happen in a lot of games, actually. And that's just one of those weird video game quirks that's actually kind of amusing more than anything else, so it really ends up not being that big of a problem. But there is one really nasty problem that the visuals have, and that is that the pre-rendered cutscenes are done in a very low quality video format, and so they are not only 30 FPS, whereas the game runs at 60, but they actually are a compressed video file, so they're really pixelated, and they just look downright awful. Especially when you compare them to the cutscenes that are actually in-game, which are running at the normal 60 FPS, and they look just fine because they're at the actual resolution you're running the game at anyway. There are also a few issues with the menus not exactly being made for high resolutions, so there is some aliasing on the text when you actually try to run it at higher resolutions, but that's more of a mild annoyance than anything else, so it's really not that big of a deal. But then there's the sound design, which is going to be a bit hit or miss for you depending on whether or not you appreciate John Woo's old Hong Kong action flicks like Hard Boiled. Although the sound effects in this are kind of lackluster, especially when you think about John Woo having these really awesome hard-hitting sounds when he was making his movies, with all sorts of carnage happening all over the place, guns sounding actually really powerful, things like that. And in this one, the explosions are kinda the weapon sounds are generally pretty wimpy, and that's just a shame because you do have some pretty solid environmental carnage noises going on when you're just sliding over tables or blasting the living crap out of things, but the weapon sounds themselves are just wimpy. It would have been really great if they had actually gotten some really nice bass on those and made them a lot more beefy. But then there's the parts that are going to be really hit or miss for you, and those are the voice acting and the music. The voice acting in this is unfortunately entirely in English. It would have been so much better if this game were in Cantonese with English subtitles instead, because that's what the actual Hong Kong action movies were filmed with. They were all done in Cantonese and they just have subtitles on them. And the fact that this is in English actually does make it a bit harder to digest the fact that there is so much melodrama in this thing. They just ham it up in a lot of spots, and that's exactly how the actual John Woo action movies are. It's just that they're in Cantonese with subtitles, so it actually ends up sounding better to a Western audience that way. And if you can understand the fact that it's not really meant to be taken completely seriously, and it's supposed to be ridiculously cheesy and melodramatic, it's perfectly fine. I mean, I like John Woo's movies, and so I'm perfectly fine with this, even though it is still in English, but you may or may not have problems with that depending on whether or not you are A, a fan of John Woo's movies, and B, okay with the kind of corny melodrama that tends to go on in these things. Similarly, you may or may not be able to get anything out of the soundtrack, considering that a lot of it sounds like it was ripped straight from a Hong Kong action movie and is absolutely brilliant for what's going on. There's a very nice blend of Asian and Western influences in the music, and they also have some things like some lounge music being played in one particular part of the game, and it actually outright references it in the game, which is just wonderful.
Who told you to stop playing?
As a result of things like that, the game just absolutely oozes style and charm, and it is really hard to not get wrapped up in it. But of course, presentation isn't everything, and what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although the story does take somewhat of a backseat to the gameplay in this. The story has you playing as Inspector Tequila, and it actually starts out kind of all over the place. The intro sequence doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the rest of the game, and it isn't really until Chapter 2 that you actually start to get into the main part of the plot, which is basically Tequila going on a one-man war against the Triads and eventually the Russian mob in Chicago, oddly enough. In no small part due to the fact that a particular triad that is working with that Russian mob has actually abducted a couple of people who are actually very close to him, and thus it ends up being a rather cliche in certain ways plot that never really gets all that coherent, but is enough to keep you going throughout the game, and it definitely feels appropriate to a John Woo movie, but it could have been done better, honestly. As it stands, it's just got the John Woo style down, and unfortunately it just doesn't really have much substance to it. So it really does fall to the gameplay to bring things up, and that's where things actually get really interesting. See, this is a bit more than just your average third-person shooter. While you do only get 2 weapon slots, these can be all sorts of different weapons, from pistols to machine guns to assault rifles to shotguns, and while there are only a handful of weapons that you can actually get, you can dual-wield certain weapons, like the pistols and the submachine guns, in order to give out maximum firepower. And in true action movie style, you never have to reload. You just have an ammo pool and you can just shoot as long as you want, as long as you have ammo in your reserve pool, in order to be able to just eviscerate your foes. I mean, that's certainly not a novel concept. It's been around for quite a long time and used to be the standard for old school shooters, but it's something you don't really see all that much in modern games anymore, and certainly by the time this thing came out, it actually was not that commonplace. So it's kind of weird having an old school thing that used to be standard being actually kind of refreshing in a more modern era, but it definitely fits the kind of action movie vibe they're going for. I mean, can you name any action movies off the top of your head that actually do have frequent reloading and realistic amounts of reloading? Probably not. More often than not, the protagonist is just going to keep firing no matter how many bullets the actual gun holds or anything like that. You'll see 6 shooters firing good 20 shots before they reload, or the gun will run out at just the right time, even though they've been firing about 100 rounds beforehand or something like that, just for dramatic effect. And so it definitely fits what's going on here. But that's pretty much where all the normal third-person shooter stuff ends and all the John Woo begins. You can, of course, dive all over the place. You can hop over low tables or low obstacles. You can kick over tables and take cover behind them. You can take cover if you want, but it's really not that effective in the long run for the most part. You can do flips off of walls. You can jump on a rail and slide down it, or if it's a horizontal rail, you can just kind of run along it. And for the most part, it all works surprisingly well. I have had a few issues with the cover system, like I said, but other than that, it is a surprisingly smooth game, even though it doesn't necessarily necessarily look all that smooth. And it should be noted as well that the cover system does have issues more than simply just not working as well as it probably should. It also degrades in a lot of cases, so the enemy will actually just whittle down your cover over time, and eventually it'll be basically useless. And that's that environmental destruction at work. There are so many things in the environment that can be absolutely demolished in a glorious fashion, and it's incredibly satisfying walking into a nice pristine area and then just completely laying waste to everything in the ensuing gunfight. And as you're hopping around on the railings and diving over things and rolling over tables and such like that, you can't help but feel like a complete badass. And that is helped immensely by the addition of what this game calls tequila time, but it's more commonly known as bullet time. The game goes into slow-mo, and in this case it gets into a sepia hue, and it allows you to line up that perfect shot and take down an enemy really quickly. Now, how much tequila time you can actually use is dependent on how much your orange bar has filled up. It just gradually goes up over time, and as you get kills and such like that, it will increase a bit faster. And one particularly nice feature is to dive, which not only makes it a bit harder for enemies to hit you as you're moving, but it also allows you to dive into cover or to dive into a better position to shoot at enemies, or in some cases you can actually dive onto carts and roll forward and continue shooting at things. And it goes without saying that you can of course use this to dive over obstacles, but one really neat thing about it is that when you're just diving around and there's nothing really in the vicinity, you don't need to worry about your tequila time meter going down, because unlike in say Max Payne, where when you do a shoot dodge it automatically drains some of your bullet time meter, this only activates the bullet time automatically if you're in the middle of a dive or you're jumping over an obstacle just by moving forward or something like that when you're actually aiming at an enemy. Now, of course, they made the radius for how you're aiming at that particular enemy rather wide, so it will activate the bullet time and allow you to line up that shot pretty easily, but it's not so wide that if you are not really looking anywhere near them, it will actually just activate out of spite, basically. So that does help to conserve your tequila time for when you really need it, and using that wisely is going to be a major part of the game. In addition to the tequila time and the wild movement you can do, there is also a meter at the bottom left of the screen that gradually fills up in a circular pattern. And this will fill up by doing two things, first of which being that you can find a paper crane somewhere in the environment which will instantly give you a fourth of that meter just right then and there, or you can get stylish kills which will gradually fill up your meter. Stylish kills being stuff like, say, on a rail when you're sliding down, or jumping on one of the carts and sliding around, or doing a dodge jump kill, or something like that. Something that is more in line with a John Woo movie than a standard third-person shooter. This also includes getting environmental kills, which are very situational and basically involve things like shooting, say, a hanging light, which will then fall and smash an enemy, or say you hit a sign that will swing down and smack them in the face, or something like that. So you got plenty of options for wasting enemies in style, and as you do that, as I said, this meter will fill up. It's called the Tequila Bomb meter, and it grants you access to 4 abilities, the first of which is just to instantly heal yourself, the second of which allows you to make a long-range precision shot, which will have the camera follow the bullet and as it impacts the target, show the target flailing around in agony as he rides to his doom. It's pretty glorious, actually. But the other 2 powers can be pretty amusing as well. The first of them is that you just load your weapon up and then you just continuously fire, basically immune to damage yourself and just streaming out an endless stream of bullets, at least for a short period of time. And it does not deplete your ammunition, which is wonderful. But the best one is saved for last, because it's the spin shot, where Tequila will spin around in slow motion, firing his weapon, and anything within range of this particular power is instantly annihilated except for boss enemies, which take a considerable amount of damage. And not only are you spinning around and blasting your foes with this, you see doves flying around in true John Woo fashion. It is ridiculously cheesy, and I absolutely love it. And speaking of ridiculously cheesy, there's also an element that pops up in certain parts of the game where you have a standoff with a bunch of bad guys, and you're having to literally dodge bullets by moving left and right, and then bring up your crosshair and shoot the bad guys at the same time, or shoot, say, a canister nearby that will blow up in their face or something like that. And while it does have a pretty significant problem of not really being able to tell exactly where the bullets the enemies are shooting at you are going to actually land, and thus making it kind of hard to dodge things, and particularly the further further you get in the game, the harder it actually gets. When you've managed to dodge every single bullet, not taken a bit of damage, and just wiped out all of the bad guys in one fell swoop, it is ridiculously satisfying. In fact, the only thing that doesn't really make you feel all that much like a badass are the boss fights in this thing, which are ridiculously standard, all things considered. The bosses are just kind of bullet spongy, and they may have a certain attack pattern that you need to get down, but really it's nothing that you can't handle with just some liberal application of the endless stream of bullets power that you get. So those are pretty disappointing, and also disappointing is the game's length. There are only 7 chapters in this whole thing, and while they are decently sized for third-person shooter levels, it still ends up going by pretty quickly, although you do have to remember that this game is actually pretty damn hard. Particularly when you get to the later levels, it starts throwing more and more enemies at you, and it becomes harder and harder to deal with. And that's on the normal difficulty setting. There are 2 other settings. You've got the actual hard mode, and then you've got the casual mode, which I guess is there if you just want to feel like a complete badass and nothing else. But even normal mode ends up being pretty difficult at times, so you do need to go into this thing being aware that it's not going to just let you walk straight through this thing without any effort whatsoever unless you turn it on casual mode. It's certainly a far cry from most modern games where they're just a complete cakewalk unless you put it on the absolute hardest setting. And while that can be pretty frustrating at times, more often than not, the frustration is actually with yourself for not actually managing your tequila time better and actually putting rounds on target and not just spraying bullets everywhere like a madman or something like that. So what you end up with is a pretty challenging third-person shooter that just oozes style from every single pore and absolutely nails the feel of a John Woo action movie in every regard. It is ridiculous, it is cheesy as hell, and it's just a lot of fun. And it is a damn shame that it just passed everybody by and hardly anyone you talk to even knows this thing exists. Hell, I even forgot it existed until I found it in my bargain bin for $1, and I am so glad I picked it up. If you were one of the few people there when I was starting to mess around with streaming and I decided to try to stream this, I was just basically giggling like a buffoon the entire time I was playing it because I was just having so damn much fun with it. And I think that should probably speak for itself. It is by no means a perfect game, but frankly, when you start playing this thing, you just don't care about that because you're having too much fun. I ultimately give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.